This next is an example of an incredibly weak challenge coming from a superior intellect, which I take Richard Dawkins to be, by the way. Very smart guy, makes very foolish mistakes in thinking when it comes to spiritual things. Let me just read the challenge that's offered, and then I'll respond. Dawkins argued in The God Delusion that it is logically impossible for God to be both all-knowing and all-powerful. The reason is because if God knows all things, then it's impossible for him to change his mind. After all, if he knew ahead of time that he was going to change his mind, then his mind would effectively already be changed. But if it's impossible for God to change his mind, then God is not all-powerful. There are a whole host of confusions here that Richard Dawkins is guilty of. Notice how he's trying to argue, by the way. He's trying to argue against the idea of God based on coherence. That is, there's something incoherent or contradictory about the Christian view of God, and if contradictory, then this broad notion must be false. It's a very powerful way to argue, because if it goes through, then we're beaten, because contradiction is the strongest kind of defeater. The problem is it doesn't go through, it doesn't even come near to that, principally because of a number of confusions that Dawkins is taken with. For one, he is misunderstanding the notion of omnipotence, where he thinks that omnipotence means that one who is omnipotent can do anything without any qualification. The word omnipotence means omnipotence. That means all power. So omnipotence entails the ability to do anything that power is capable of doing. So God is not limited by any lack of power to do anything that power might accomplish. Now, when it comes to making square circles, for example, this is something that God cannot do. But the lack is not in virtue of power, because an infinite amount of power cannot do something that is logically incoherent. And so therefore, that God lacks the, if you will, ability to make square circles is in no wise a limitation on his omnipotence. The classical characteristic of God is still intact in spite of those kinds of challenges. So that's the first problem. The second problem is he thinks that that the ability to change one's mind is a bona fide positive ability. And he's mistaken on this. Let me put it in different terms that are more obvious. The first time that I heard this problem voiced is when someone suggested that God must be able to sin, because if God can't sin, then I can do something that God can't do, which would make me more able than God, and that doesn't make any sense, so God must be able to sin. Of course, the confusion here is that with the issue of sinning, you have a perfection that is unwittingly identified as a limitation, because the perfection is expressed in the negative. So the perfection is perfect goodness. There is no lack in perfect goodness. But perfect goodness stated in the negative means that God is not capable of failing morally. Well, so when you put it that way, it sounds like a lack of ability, but in fact, it's only because of the way you've worded it. It isn't a lack of ability, it is the presence of a moral perfection that means you are not able to fall short of the perfection. So when you are perfect, you're not able to be unperfect. Well, that's not a liability of perfection, for goodness sake. That is the perfection. So when God can't sin, that simply means that he's perfectly holy. And that's a virtue, not a vice. That is an ability, not an inability. And by the same token, if God cannot change his mind, this is a negative expression of a positive feature, actually a perfection. That perfection is omniscience. So his inability to change his mind, if one calls it an inability, is only because of the reality of a perfection. And an ability to change one's mind identifies not actually a good ability, but an imperfection in knowledge. So we as Christians hold that God is all-powerful, and he is all-knowing. Any shortcoming in knowing, no matter how it's stated, is not an inability. I'm sorry, any shortcoming of knowing, no matter how it's stated, is a type of inability. Perfect knowledge, which means the lack of the ability, if you will, to change mind, is the perfection. There's no difficulty there, Mr. Dawkins. You've got it inside out. And secondly, with regards to the power issue, again, not being able or having the power to change your mind is irrelevant. God doesn't have the ability to do something that's contradictory, particularly to his character. This is not a limitation of power. God has all the power that is necessary to do anything that power can do. That's omnipotence. So I'm sorry, Professor Dawkins. You're 100% wrong in every item here, which means you get an F on this particular term paper. Better luck next time.